It's a very great pleasure to be here this evening with you all, and I also want to commend the NEU, the Gambia Teachers Union, and the Steve Sinnott Foundation for working on this very, very practical resource and the idea of a competition which can engage everybody, as Antoinette highlighted. What I want to do is to just briefly talk about human rights education in a global framework, and to think what that framework is, briefly where we've got to see what successes we might celebrate in human rights education over the past years, and to look at some challenges. And in many ways, I will be echoing or reinforcing points that other speakers have already said. As has been pointed out, the key framework, legal framework for human rights education is the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also, as Gus referred to, the Sustainable Development Goals, which really support many of the goals of human rights. And the point I want to make about these two important international agreements is that they don't just guarantee the right to education, but they actually guarantee the right to human rights education. So if you read the aims of education in the Universal Declaration, you will see that they actually require an education which is in conformity with the ideals of the UN. And likewise, in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it doesn't just guarantee for every child this entitlement to education, but actually spells out that all children have the right to a human rights education. And I think that is something which teachers, and particularly teachers' unions, can work hard to communicate, because I feel that point isn't as widely shared even amongst education professionals, let alone amongst governments who decide what they think education should be about. On the other hand, we've got this global framework, but we've also got we've seen very, very important social movements for justice over recent months, particularly during the pandemic. We've seen how people have been moved to show generosity, solidarity, extend kindness to others, and to fight for justice globally, building on Black Lives Matter in the United States, the Me Too movement, and Youth for Climate Change. And I think our NGOs and our trade unions have a very, very key part to bring these two together, to bring social movements on the one hand and awareness of these international agreements and what they actually mean in terms of human rights education. How then is the global framework useful for teachers? Well, we've heard that many teachers may struggle to engage in questions around justice. They may struggle to express points of view which are unpopular or which are unfashionable with governments. But I think human rights education, if they're aware that these international agreements support human rights education, I do think that gives extra power and confidence to teachers in many situations, and it enables them to share that knowledge with their students. And as Gus has spelled out, human rights education offers really an alternative frame of reference to these narrowly focused national values that are sometimes promoted. And this is super important, really important amongst student populations who are diverse in their makeup, and who may be forced to swallow one way of being a national of a country rather than accept students in all their diversity. So I think that's a very powerful element of the human rights framework. As Daniel mentioned earlier, the Convention on the Rights of the Child places children's views, children's experience, and children's concerns at the heart of schooling. And I can't stress that point enough. And children's concerns and children's experience and children's rights are sometimes there is anxiety that these may be in competition with those of adults. I find that's rarely the case, but I do recall when I first talked about the Convention on the Rights of the Child a long while ago in Botswana, the people I was discussing with said, well, hold on a minute, is this, we're going to work against the rights of mothers? So I think it's important to understand the links between children's rights being put at the front and those of parents and teachers don't necessarily by any means have to be in conflict, as I will try and illustrate in a moment. Human rights skills are life skills. They're important for all children: cooperation, mutual respect, solidarity, learning to live together, protecting the vulnerable. And I think that's the key point about human rights and human rights education, that human rights are about protecting the vulnerable. And it's important to remember that all of us, and I include myself amongst this, all of us are vulnerable at some point, and recognizing that helps us frame solidarity in a framework which is much more equal. It's not giving to others or being generous. It's actually a mutual support in many ways. Children's skills of learning how to make a difference and achieving it, that is clearly empowering. When young people feel they can make a difference, then that is going to change the whole atmosphere of schooling. Some of the successes of human rights education over the years, we've heard some of the problems already, but we have seen global movements. We've seen UNICEF working on rights respecting schools as it does in the UK, but also child-friendly schools in other places. Another success I would link to human rights education is public awareness of concerns like homelessness, sexual harassment, climate change, and many other issues, the rights of sexual minorities, increasingly recognized by the public as human rights issues. They're not just belonging to them, but they are rights of us all. Also, we've seen the incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law in so many nations. This hasn't happened yet in the United Kingdom, but we've seen a strong effort to make that happen in Scotland. And I do believe that although there was a challenge in the High Court, that people are working very, very hard to ensure that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is incorporated into domestic law. Those kinds of movements, I think teachers and teachers' unions can play a very, very important role in. I think one of the successes of human rights education is when we see people's organizations ready to step in and step up when governments fail to act. Governments have an obligation to teach, to ensure that children have the right to human rights education. Governments have an obligation to uphold our human rights. But when they don't do that, it is also the obligation of us as citizens to step up and struggle there. The number of teacher unions internationally offering training programs in human rights education is encouraging to me. And this is happening where in our universities, there is still very little opportunity for teachers to study human rights on a uniform basis and across the board. It's growing, but it's not by any means a guaranteed part of initial teacher training in many places. And human rights research human rights education research is now recognized. There are people studying in this field. There are people doing their PhDs in this field. This research is now available to teachers. And in the last 5 years, we now see 2 journals on human rights education available to teachers. They are both open access, so there's no paywall. Nobody has to pay to write there. And they're available to teachers and to public more widely. In the one that I've been involved in most closely, Human Rights Education Review, we're very, very proud, for example, that we've published the first article, we believe, on human rights education in Nigeria, a young scholar raising many real issues and suggesting ways forward for human rights education in that context. Challenges. I think still human rights remain something that we often see that we have and they either don't deserve or don't have. And so there is still a very much a divide, and still human rights education is sometimes presented in established democratic countries like the one I work in and the Nordic countries, where human rights are us and others don't have them. And there is a risk in human rights education of promoting a sense of superiority that I think we need to guard against. And I would think that was very, very important for the UK. International growth of authoritarian regimes across the world is another threat to human rights education, and the inflexible and curriculum frameworks and accountability mechanisms, inspection regimes that give very little attention to principles, creativity, and our shared humanity, those things that Gus has raised already, I think remain challenges for us all, and we need to tackle those, recognizing their threat, not just to our well-being of education, but actually to human rights itself. I believe that there is a challenge still in building solidarity across differences, across different organizations, across different struggles for justice. But I think that building solidarities across different sites is one means of strengthening the field, but it remains a challenge to us. So those are my points, and thank you very much for listening.